was 6:47 in the morning when my doorbell camera sent a notification to my phone. I was still half asleep, reaching for my coffee on the nightstand, and I almost ignored it. I get delivery notifications all the time, but something made me tap the screen. And there he was. My grandfather, 81 years old, standing on my front porch in a flannel shirt and slippers, no coat. It was 34 degrees outside. He had one duffel bag at his feet, the old green canvas one he'd had since before I was born, and he was standing there with both arms wrapped around himself, looking at my door like he was afraid to knock. I was down the stairs before I even put shoes on. When I opened the door, he looked up at me, and the first thing he said was, "I'm sorry to show up like this, sweetheart. I didn't know where else to go." I pulled him inside. His hands were ice cold. His slippers were wet from the grass in my yard. He smelled like the Old Spice aftershave he'd worn my whole life. And I held on to him in my entryway, and I couldn't speak for a second. I was trying so hard not to cry in front of him because he already looked so small, and I didn't want him to feel worse than he already did. I asked him how long he'd been outside. He said my uncle had dropped him off about 40 minutes ago. 40 minutes. In 34-degree weather, in slippers. I want to be very clear about something before I go any further. My grandfather is not a man who complains. He's not a man who asks for help. He spent 32 years working construction, raised 4 kids mostly on his own after my grandmother passed, never once asked any of us for a single thing. He's the kind of man who shows up for other people and then quietly disappears before anyone can thank him. So when he stood in my entryway and told me he was sorry for the inconvenience, I knew exactly how bad things must have gotten for him to end up on my porch. Let me back up and explain how we got here. My grandfather's name is Walter. My uncle, his son, my dad's younger brother, is named Keith. Keith is 54 years old, lives about 20 minutes from my grandfather's house, and for the past 2 years has been managing my grandfather's finances under a power of attorney that my grandfather signed when he had a minor stroke in the spring of 2023. The stroke was small. My grandfather recovered almost completely. He walks fine, talks fine, remembers everything. His doctor cleared him, but Keith used that window. Those few weeks when Grandpa was in the hospital and then in short-term rehab to get him to sign over power of attorney. I didn't find out about it until months later. My grandfather mentioned it almost in passing, the way he mentions everything, like it was just paperwork, like it was nothing. I should have pushed harder then. I didn't. That's on me. What I didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that once Keith had that document signed, he started quietly repositioning himself. He started paying my grandfather's bills from my grandfather's accounts. He started managing the property. He had my grandfather's mail forwarded to his address. He took over the cell phone plan, and he told my grandfather repeatedly that this was all to protect him. That family takes care of family, that Grandpa shouldn't have to worry about any of it. My grandfather believed him. Of course he did. Keith is his son. Over those 2 years, my grandfather's savings went from approximately $140,000, money he'd put away over decades, money from selling the house he and my grandmother had built together, down to somewhere around $18,000. Keith has never given a clear accounting of where it went. When my grandfather asked, Keith said there were property taxes, medical costs, insurance, some of it maybe, but $122,000 doesn't disappear into property taxes on a paid-off house in rural Ohio. But here's the thing that I think is important for people to understand, because I see the comments whenever I watch other people's videos like this, and everyone always asks why the family member didn't just leave. And the answer, from watching my grandfather, is this. When someone controls your phone, your mail, your bank account, and your transportation, and they are also your child and you love them, and you have loved them for 54 years, leaving is not as simple as it sounds. You don't think of it as being controlled. You think of it as being taken care of, until the day you realize those two things are not the same. The day my grandfather realized it was the day Keith told him he was moving him to a facility. Not a nice facility, not the kind with activities and a dining room and people his age. A place 45 minutes outside of town, a place where my grandfather knew no one, a place that cost $2,800 a month, and where Keith would continue to manage the payments from my grandfather's remaining account. My grandfather asked if he could think about it. Keith said it was already arranged. He told my grandfather to pack one bag. And then, instead of taking him to the facility, which I found out later, Keith had not actually confirmed or paid a deposit for, he drove to my house at 6 a.m. and left him on my porch. I think Keith assumed I would panic and call him. I think he assumed my grandfather would be so disoriented and embarrassed that he'd cooperate with whatever came next. I think Keith believed he was still in control of this situation. He was wrong. The first thing I did, after I got my grandfather inside and warmed up and sitting at my kitchen table with coffee and the eggs and toast he said he wasn't hungry for, but ate every bite of, was call my dad. My dad and Keith haven't been close in years. That's a separate story. But my dad picked up on the second ring, and when I told him what happened, there was a long silence, and then he said, "I'm on my way." While I waited for my dad, I sat with my grandfather and I asked him to tell me everything, all of it. Not just the last few weeks, all of it, from the beginning. He talked for almost 2 hours. He told me about the mail, about the bank account he'd asked to access, and Keith had said he'd handle it. About the time he asked how much money he had left, and Keith had given him a number that my grandfather now suspected wasn't true. About the phone calls he'd tried to make to his friends from his old neighborhood, calls that sometimes went through and sometimes didn't, and he'd never understood why. About the way Keith's wife would go through his room when they thought he was asleep. I was writing it all down. I have a legal pad I keep in my kitchen drawer. I use it for grocery lists and notes for work, and I flipped it to a clean page and I wrote down everything he told me, with dates when he could remember them and approximate dates when he couldn't. When my dad arrived, I showed him the notes. He sat down next to my grandfather, and he didn't say much for a while. Then he said, "Pop, I'm sorry. I should have been paying closer attention." My grandfather put his hand on my dad's arm and said, "You've got your own life." That's the kind of man he is. That afternoon, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Adult Protective Services. I know a lot of people in these situations wait, or they're not sure, or they feel like they're overreacting. I want to be direct about this. If you believe an elderly person is being financially exploited or is in an unsafe situation, call Adult Protective Services. It's free. It's confidential. They investigate. That's their job. I called. I gave them the information, and they opened a case that same day. The second call I made was to an elder law attorney. I found one in my city with good reviews who offered a free 30-minute consultation. Her name is not important, but she was calm and direct, and she asked me the right questions. When I told her about the power of attorney, she asked me when my grandfather had signed it and under what circumstances. When I explained, hospital, post-stroke, before he was fully recovered, she told me that document might be challengeable. She said to gather whatever financial records I could, any evidence of the transactions, any communications. I said, "I've already started." Because here's the other thing I want to say. I keep records. I always have. I'm a paralegal by training, though I'm not currently practicing in that field, and I have a habit, some people find it excessive, of documenting things, saving emails, taking screenshots, writing down dates and times of conversations. I had texts from Keith going back 18 months. I had a voicemail he'd left my grandfather that my grandfather had accidentally forwarded to me once, in which Keith told my grandfather not to go talking to people about family business. I had the doorbell camera footage from that morning. The timestamp showed my grandfather on my porch at 6:41 a.m. It showed Keith's truck pulling away. I sent everything to the attorney. The next few weeks were not easy. Keith called me twice. The first call was calm, almost friendly, where he explained that he'd been overwhelmed and needed some help managing things, and he was glad Grandpa was with me for now, and maybe we could all sit down and talk. I was pleasant. I said sure, we could do that. I did not tell him about the APS case. I did not tell him about the attorney. I saved the recording. The second call was different. He'd figured out by then that I'd contacted someone. I don't know how. Maybe the APS investigator reached out to him, which is standard procedure. He was angry. He told me I was tearing the family apart. He told me I didn't understand the full picture. He told me my grandfather had needed more care than any of us realized, and he'd been doing his best under difficult circumstances. I let him talk. When he finished, I said, "I hear you. I think it would be best if everything goes through the attorney from here." He hung up. I saved that recording too. The ABS investigation took about 6 weeks. During that time, a caseworker came to my house and spoke with my grandfather privately, then with me. They reviewed the financial records we provided. They contacted Keith and, I assume, interviewed him as well. My grandfather lived with me during this time. I want to say something about those 6 weeks because I think it matters. My grandfather and I had always been close. He used to pick me up from school when I was a kid, taught me to fish, came to every single one of my college graduations even though he had to drive 4 hours each way. But we had never lived together. I learned things about him I didn't know. He wakes up at 5 a.m. every morning out of pure habit. He takes his coffee black with 1 spoonful of sugar. He watches the Weather Channel even when there's no weather. He was a genuinely funny man, dry humor, the kind that sneaks up on you, and for the first time in probably 2 years, he was laughing again. He also told me, one evening when we were sitting on my back porch, that he had started to think he was becoming a burden, that maybe Keith was right, that he needed more help than family could give, that maybe the facility wasn't such a bad idea. I turned to look at him and I said, "Do you believe that? Or did someone tell you to believe that?" He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I think someone told me to believe it." The legal process moved in 2 tracks. On the civil side, the attorney filed a petition to revoke the power of attorney and to have a neutral third-party guardian appointed to manage my grandfather's finances while the case was reviewed. Keith contested it. He hired his own attorney. There were filings and counterfilings, and a date was set for a hearing. On the financial side, the picture that emerged was, I'll just say it plainly, theft. Of the $122,000 that had left my grandfather's accounts over 22 months, the attorney's forensic review identified roughly $34,000 in legitimate expenses, medical bills, utilities, property taxes, insurance, groceries. The remaining $88,000 plus could not be accounted for by any documentation Keith provided. There were transfers to accounts in Keith's name. There were cash withdrawals with no receipts. There was a charge for a vacation, a week in Myrtle Beach for Keith, his wife, and their 2 adult kids, billed to my grandfather's account. I read that and I had to put the papers down and just sit for a minute. At the hearing, my grandfather testified. He was calm and clear and precise. He remembered dates. He remembered conversations. He told the judge about the morning he was left on my porch, about the slippers, about the 40 minutes in 34-degree weather. The judge asked him if he had wanted to go to a care facility. My grandfather said, "No, Your Honor. I wanted to stay in my home." I was sitting 3 rows back, and I had to press my lips together very hard. The judge revoked the power of attorney. She appointed a professional fiduciary, a neutral third party, to manage my grandfather's remaining finances and review the past transactions. She also referred the case to the county prosecutor's office for potential criminal charges related to financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. In Ohio, that can be a felony. Keith did not look at us when he left the courtroom. My grandfather's house is still his. He's back in it now. A home health aide comes 3 mornings a week. Not because he needs intensive care, but because he wanted some help, and because now that we know what help is supposed to look like, he's willing to accept it. My dad calls him every Sunday. I drive out there every other weekend, and we sit on his porch and drink coffee, and he tells me stories about my grandmother that I'd never heard before. He got a new phone. The number is just mine and my dad's and a few of his friends from his old bowling league, guys he hadn't talked to in over a year because somehow his calls to them kept not going through. His Social Security checks, $1,840 a month, now go into an account that only he and the fiduciary can access. The fiduciary sends him a monthly statement. He reads every line. He told me recently that he feels like himself again, that he hadn't realized how much of himself he'd lost until he started getting it back. As for Keith, the criminal referral is pending. I can't speak to where that process is or what will come of it, because it's ongoing and I've been advised not to discuss specifics. What I can say is that the process exists, it has been initiated, and there are people whose job it is to follow through on it. What I want people to take away from this, because I know a lot of you watching this have someone in your life, a parent, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, and you have a feeling that something is off but you're not sure if you're overreacting, you're not sure if it's your place, is this. Document everything. Dates, times, conversations, transactions, Whatever you can get. You don't have to be a paralegal to keep a legal pad in your kitchen drawer. Call Adult Protective Services if you believe someone is being financially exploited or placed in an unsafe situation. Their number is 1-800-677-1116. It's free. It's not overreacting. It is exactly what that system exists for. Find an elder law attorney. Most offer free consultations. The National Elder Law Foundation has a directory online. And if someone you love is standing on your porch in their slippers in 34-degree weather, and they say they're sorry to bother you, please understand that it took everything they had to get there, and the best thing you can do is open the door and not let them apologize for it. My grandfather was standing on my porch for 40 minutes before I got that notification. I think about that a lot. I think about what would have happened if I'd silenced my phone that morning. If I'd rolled back over and gone to sleep. I got lucky, and I'm not going to pretend that everyone does. But if you're paying attention, if you know where to look and what to do, you can change what happens next. My grandfather is sitting in his own kitchen right now, drinking his coffee black with 1 spoonful of sugar, watching the Weather Channel, and that is exactly where he is supposed to be. I keep coming back to that image of my grandfather standing on my porch in his slippers, arms wrapped around himself, afraid to knock. He's a man who built things with his hands for 32 years, a man who drove 4 hours each way to watch me walk across a graduation stage, a man who never once asked anyone for anything. And there he was, at 6:47 in the morning in 34-degree weather, apologizing for existing. That image tells you everything you need to know about what prolonged manipulation does to a person. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't leave visible marks. It works slowly. The way water works on stone, just steady pressure, day after day, until the person stops believing they deserve to take up space. My grandfather didn't end up on that porch because he was weak. He ended up there because someone who was supposed to love him decided over and over again that his trust was more useful than his well-being, and the cruelest part of it was that Keith never had to force him. He just had to be patient and keep reframing things until my grandfather couldn't tell the difference between being cared for and being managed. What I want people to understand, and I mean really understand, not just nod it, is that what stopped. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't fate. It was a series of choices that my grandfather made, and that I made, and those choices were rooted in something that I think we underestimate all the time. The decision to act on what you know is right even when it is genuinely hard, and the outcome is not guaranteed. My grandfather made the choice to get in that truck and tell the driver to take him to my house instead of to a facility he'd never agreed to. That took more courage than most people will ever be asked to have. He had to override 54 years of loving his son. He had to admit, at 81 years old, that the person he trusted most had been lying to him. That is not a small thing. That is an act of extraordinary moral clarity. Knowing what is right and choosing it even when everything in you wants to find an excuse not to. And on my end, what I had wasn't bravery exactly. It was preparation. Years of keeping notes, saving messages, understanding how systems work and how to use them. When the moment came, I didn't have to figure out what to do. I already knew. The legal pad was in the drawer. The attorney's number took 30 seconds to find. The doorbell footage was already saved to the cloud. Knowledge is not passive. It only protects you if you've built it before you need it, and if you're willing to act on it when the stakes are real and the person on the other side is someone you share a last name with. What happened to Keith was not something that was done to him from the outside. It was the natural conclusion of the path he had been walking for 2 years. When you take $88,000 from an old man in slippers, when you forward his mail and screen his calls and tell him he's a burden until he believes it, you are not just committing financial fraud. You are making a series of choices that have consequences. The court didn't punish Keith out of cruelty. The court simply recorded what he had already done to himself. My grandfather is home now. He reads his bank statements every month. He calls his friends on Sundays. He laughs that dry, quiet laugh that sneaks up on you. He told me recently that the hardest part wasn't the money or the cord or any of it. The hardest part was learning, at 81, to stop apologizing for needing people. I think about that a lot. I think most of us could stand to learn that a little sooner.